right. On the move, we got our, what should we call you? You're like our equine policy expert, our resident equine policy expert.
Okay.
Yeah. So, Cliff Williamson, back on the
round two.
podcast. We appreciate it, man. Yeah. Because we didn't talk about enough polarizing things with Tennessee walking horses and racing and whatnot. We had to have you back on so we could stir the pot a little more.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
Yeah, today I think this is going to end up being episode 31. So we got episode 31 with Cliff here. But today is going to be all about feral horses.
Okay.
Or we as a group, we can talk about what we want to call them, because even when you call them, whatever you choose to call them, that can be drawing a line in the sand for some people. So, I call them feral horses.
There are feral horses. There are also wild horses. There's two distinct
I think we ought to call them
populations.
Cute little honey pies that everybody should adopt. That's kind of the word on the street, that everybody needs a Mustang, right, Cliff? Haven't you heard that?
Everybody needs a Mustang. Everybody needs a Mustang. Everybody needs a Mustang.
Do you agree with that, or do you not agree?
No, that's. Well, so it's funny. So I think, the best way to start talking about this is to identify what the problem is, I think, and talk about what we're actually diving into. There's two important numbers that you need to look into anytime you're going to start this conversation. And the numbers change every single year. So it's really important that you stay up to date about it. The first number comes from the Bureau of Land Management, and that number every single year around March, they release the population figure for the number of wild horses that are under their control. And as of March 1st of 2022, there are 86,000 wild horses under the control of the Department of Interior's Bureau of Land Management. That includes burros and horses, and those are confined to about 250 individual herd management areas that were specifically identified and defined in the Wild Horse and Burro Protection Act. Wild Horse and Burro Protection Act was a bill that was passed in the early 70s and mid 70s. And they defined specific areas that already had populations of wild horses. And then they created a carrying capacity for those areas based on how many wild horses they thought those areas could contain and sustain. So what we're talking about is 86,000 horses that are out on the range. Then the other number that we have to look at is every single year in the president's annual budget, there is going to be a dollar figure that is attached to the Bureau of Land Management's Wild Horse and Burro program. That number it varies, goes up and down. Well, it actually just goes up and up. Sometimes it doesn't go up, but anytime it changes, it always goes up. And this year, and I pulled that website up before we got started, this year, that figure went up $11 million over last year to $148 million.
Wow.
So the Bureau of Land Management is going to get, for 2023, $148 million to take care of 86,000 horses.
And this is very specific to the wild horses. Like, this isn't like the whatever wildlife department that'd be taking care of elk and deer and like all these other native species. This is specifically for horses that are wild on the range that like fall in this weird category?
In these specific locations.
Yeah, in these specific locations. Is there like a
Yep.
line of demarcation between like where they start? Because it's mostly in the West, right?
Yes, yeah. It's mostly in the West. It ranges, goes up Colorado. Maybe there's one wild herd in Montana. Can't remember. Goes all the way south to the Mexican border. Effectively, it skirts around tribal reservations, which is important when you get into Nevada and Arizona, because those same populations of animals are crossing those geographical lines, those arbitrary man-made lines. But, so that gives them access for a huge part of the Western United States. We don't have any recognized wild horse populations east of the Mississippi. Now we do have feral populations east of the Mississippi. We have feral populations all over the country. There's a feral population of horses probably at least every state. Maybe not Alaska, but I'm sure there's feral horses in Hawaii. And those horses, we don't have any figures for those animals. There's no federal agency that tracks those populations. There's no budgetary allotment at the federal level for those populations. Those animals are trespassing basically everywhere they go.
Yeah. So, and this was my understanding before, but I think you kind of illustrated it, Cliff. It's important to realize that wild horse is more of like a legal definition.
Yep.
Than anything.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, it's referring to the horses on those lands that BLM is responsible for. Those are wild horses.
Those are wild horses as defined by the Wild Horse and Burro Protection Act. Yep.
Because that's what I was going to ask you. There's not much difference between the feral horses that you find in these eastern states, or the ones you talked about in every state, and the ones that are on BLM land. For the most part, they're all kind of feral horses under different legal titles.
Sure. I mean, they're undomesticated. Yeah. They have different legal definitions, but they are all undomesticated animals. And even that becomes a gray area. You look at animals like the Chincoteague ponies here in Virginia. Those animals are heavily managed, closely watched. They're engaged with annually as a whole group. You have tourist attractions like the animals you see in Corolla on the Outer Banks, North Carolina. I can't remember. There's a couple of very famous herds of air quotes wild horses, Mustangs, in different reserves or sanctuaries around the country. And that's where a lot of the animals in Colorado and Montana and things are named herds, but those herds are actually not protected by the Wild Horse and Burro Protection Act. When you get into the nitty gritty of this whole conversation, genetically, you have similarities in certain parts of the country, but there is a clear Mustang type once you get closer to the Rockies. And that is traditionally what people think of when they're talking about wild horses. They're not thinking of ponies. They're not thinking of loose quarter horses. They're not thinking about, Florida cracker horses or some of the other organically derived North American breeds. Some of the accidental Spanish breeds that were left over. You've got San Juan horses. You've got some other populations of animals that exist on The west coast of the United States also, those are not protected. Those are not technically wild. They're just domestic populations of feral horses that created some kind of niche breed type. And then somebody cared enough to start chronicling their bloodlines. So now they're kind of their own thing.
Is there any?
I want to back up just a little bit to talk about like what, because the big thing that people talk about is the Wild Horse and Burro Act, right? And that was in 71, I believe.
I had to look it up, but yeah.
So the thing, I think most people listening to this will probably understand, but I want to just lay it all out so we talk about like what caused that act, right? So you start however many, it was like 13,000 years ago. There were horses in North America. They died out. Then there are no horses in North America for 13,000 years until the 1500s. Spanish land in mainland Mexico and go up into the American Southwest, so New Mexico, Arizona, like the Pueblo area. And one of the things I thought was really interesting was that it was actually horses for the most part were kind of contained there for a good amount of time before this event called the Pueblo Revolt, where basically that's when all the horses got out, and then they made their way up the Great Plains to tribes like the Comanches and the Sioux and all these things we think of as horse cultures. And then once the kind of cat was out of the bag, the horses went everywhere. And Indians started trading them like crazy, even to the point to where there's reports of horses getting all the way back east to like the French trappers on the Mississippi River. So horses spread like wildfire. But relatively speaking, like when Lewis and Clark did their expedition in the early 1800s, a lot of the tribes that they were encountering in the northern Great Plains had only really been horse tribes for about 50 years at that point.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't like because a lot of people kind of in the American mythos is like the mounted Native American, right? And so but it's not necessarily as long a tradition as you think. And the reason I'm bringing all that up is we'll get to it later, but that's kind of like an argument some people use is how like horses are ingrained in our culture, which they definitely are, but I'm just trying to keep things in perspective. And then from there, the horses spread like wildfire, I'm sure displacing native species even back then. And then you fast forward to like the 50s and 60s, and the Mustangs are everywhere, and you have these guys called Mustangers, and their job is basically to round up, wild horses, feral horses, whatever you want to call them. They round up the Mustangs and, send them to slaughter to be used in like sausage, dog food, whatever. And it gets to the point where there was an estimated 25,000 feral horses left in the United States. And that prompted Congress to go in 1971 pass the Wild Horse and Burro Act. And so that's where we are live at Cliff, our resident policy expert. That's why we have something called the Wild Horse and Burro Act, because in the 60s and 70s, they felt like there was a need to do something to preserve these animals. And I'm sure we can get into if that was a good decision, if that was a bad decision, where that initiative has kind of gone in the last 50 years. But that's the background of why this act is in place. And so I just wanted to lay that out there for anyone listening, because I feel like having that perspective kind of sets the table to have the conversation a little better.
Oh, yeah, it's a good catch. And I would add, the movement of horses north that you talked about, do not discount that was because of indigenous populations, and this air quote again, discovering this new mode of transportation, and then all of the benefits that came with it. That allowed, it changed their cultures in ways that, we don't have a written record of, we don't have a history for, but it created opportunities for groups of people to move further than they ever moved before. It also allowed populations of people to go and then return without all of the people that they needed to harvest, hunt, or acquire the resources they needed. And so that it didn't end the nomadic cultures that we had in our indigenous populations, but it dramatically changed it. And then that's where you saw that movement of horses as a tool. It spread very quickly because of the utility of it. It just made sense. It would only be eclipsed by the introduction of firearms. That was the only thing that made life even easier. Once you could move a lot faster, and then once you could kill stuff a lot faster, all of a sudden that's when you get the image that most people have in their minds of the American West, pre-revolution. And so there were native populations. Those populations of horses were maintained, controlled by the natural environment around them. You had a lot of different factors that kept those horse populations in check. We certainly had a stronger predator population in the regions that we're talking about here back then. Mountain lions. I mean, we have historically had jaguars in Texas, in our border states. That hasn't been a thing in a really long time. But a big cat population certainly would have impacted that. Bears had a much more southern region than they do now. Wolves, and then our other megafauna provided competition for resources, probably water most specifically, and that's what we're seeing right now. But certainly, any other grass space, or depending on seasonalities, like bad winters and things like that, would have really impacted this population of horse, because it did not have the same genetic advantages to this part of the country, this part of the world, that the bison would have had, or even most of our deer populations. And so that would keep things in check. Once humans got more engaged, and it goes back before the 60s, everybody that moved out and homesteaded and developed our western states, they immediately found these populations of free roaming animals, horses, and started taking advantage of them. They knew how to break horses. They knew how to use horses. They knew the advantages of them. And now there's just free horses around. Everybody took advantage of it. And throughout the 1800s and into the mid 1900s even, the people who were living in these areas, cohabitating these areas with these free roaming horses, would engage with these populations to make them a more appropriate type of animal that they needed. And so you would oftentimes see people kill whatever male animals were in these populations and then replace them with a more appropriate or more desirable male from their own population. And so that's when we started seeing the draft influence become much more evident in these Mustang horses. As we get further along and records were kept better, you would start seeing ranchers add color to these populations because it made them more desirable after they rounded them up and sold them to people maybe even back east. You had ranchers that had a specific type of horse that they liked or a certain set of genetics that they appreciated, and they made sure to cultivate that. So these herds were heavily influenced by the people and the ranchers that surrounded them. So to pretend like this is a natural population is ridiculous. When there's an individual at Texas A&M, I believe, if I get the college wrong, I apologize, but he has genetically tested every single wild horse herd in the United States. And he's tested them against every breed in the United States and come up with a hodgepodge of genetic markers that can attest to the fact that there is everything from Arabian horse stock to, well, the connection with thoroughbreds is pretty natural there in that place. But going to the markers that we find in quarter horses, to basically every continental draft breed, everything. Our Mustang population is a hodgepodge of every single type of horse breed or horse trait that some ranchers thought had value over the 120 years that we were developing the West. And so that getting us to the point that we're talking about where the bill was implemented in the 70s, those animals, those free roaming animals had value on the open market. There was an interest in those animals on the open market. It wasn't just rampant collection, over collection for the purposes of slaughter, but that expedited the decline in population that we saw leading in the 50s and 60s. But people were still even up to that point, people were still collecting horses for the private market, domestic use market, ranching. All of these horses still had value, and they were still being manipulated until the passage of the law. That kept the population down. Everybody had a vested interest in harvesting these animals for whatever needs that they saw fit, but not over exhausting these populations, because there was still your broodmare stock. The number of horses that were the number of animals that were incorporated into the Wild Horse and Burro Protection Act that probably had brands and probably came when you called. It was probably very high at that time, because these animals were used to being managed. But the Mexican market increased the value of horses going across the border. The U.S. beef industry had very aggressively campaigned and very successfully campaigned to get horses out of the traditional American diet. And so that had kind of killed the Mexican market as well in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. But then there were a bunch of things that happened during the 30s, 40s, and 50s that changed how the entire world saw animal protein. And that created, and then the rise of technology allowed for the exportation of uncured animal meat, and that meat didn't necessarily need to be defined. Red meat was red meat. And so that created the market, and that created the opportunity for people to take advantage of these unclaimed populations of horses. And that led to the law being passed. There was a need and a desire to protect the image that we had created that Mustangs represented for the national identity. And yeah, their idea was that there would be 27,000 wild horses protected in the United States at any given time. 27,000.
So
remember what I mentioned.
So far over that number.
86.
Yeah. But so why did it just run over that number?
So ever since the bill was passed, the population has never been managed correctly. We have never adequately collected enough horses off of the range to maintain the ideal 27,000 animal population. And I will be the first to admit that the range can clearly sustain, these herd management areas in particular, can clearly sustain more horses than the 1971 figure of 27,000. Obviously, because they're maintaining 80,000 right now. But The reality is that the environmental impacts of these animals in general, they are non-native. The environment is not meant to sustain them, and the animals that they are competing with are not evolutionarily prepared to compete with a 1,200-pound solid foot horse. They're just not.
Yeah.
The 1,200 pounds is probably an exaggeration for what these animals are actually weighing these days. But it's we're in a place where science can support or defend both positions. What we're dealing with now is what the government is prepared to do and what legislatively we're forced to deal with. And there is a very strong rule or interpretation, I should say, an interpretation that you cannot do anything fatal with these horses on the range. You can pull animals off and you can adopt them, but unless the general public is willing to adopt these horses, you're just going to have to leave them where they're at. And that, over a 40-year stint, has allowed these animals to breed exponentially and refine genetically a type of animal that can survive forever. These horses, they are only good at one thing, and that is breeding and putting more horses on the ground.
And Cliff, that 80,000 head count, is that in captivity as well in the holding pens, or is that strictly just the horses on the range?
That's the horses on the range. When you go to their website, when you go to the Bureau of Land Management's website, they'll also share their annual statistics for how many animals are in holding, how many animals have been removed, and how many animals have been treated with fertility control treatments. So for fiscal year 22, so that's September to September, October, but you know what I mean. In 2022, they had a population of 82,384 as of March 1st. They removed 20,000 horses total from the range. They placed 7,793 horses in private care, and that's either adoptions, sales, or public transfers of horses. And when you talk about transfers, the federal government does have a relationship with a lot of different entities where they transfer ownership of a horse without it being sold or without it being technically adopted. And that's where you see programs like the jail programs that have been very successful in a couple of locations. Unfortunately, our federal prison system is not managed by the government, so the public does not have a lot of input into it, and we can't collectively as a society mandate that prisoners are allowed access to these kinds of extracurricular programs. Regardless of how good they are, regardless of the positive benefits for lots of different sectors, we have privatized the prison system in the United States, and these programs are very expensive. In order to maintain horses and the kind of controls needed to allow prisoners to engage with these horses, it's wildly expensive.
Yeah, that is crazy, right?
So,
privatization.
Those are great opportunities.
Money. I'm sorry, talk over you. But if they could make money at selling horses that they had the prisoners trained, they'd probably be all over that. But they'd much rather have the prisoners working, doing something productive in some kind of a jail factory than actually reinvesting in the prisoners and using horses in a therapeutical way.
And to your point, these animals do not come out of the barn with a whole lot of value.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if they're broke, if their halter broke, if they can sleep in a stall without tearing it to pieces. They still don't come out of those facilities with a whole lot of value. And so you're not talking about $10,000 horses when they're done. And if you spent $15,000 to get an $800 horse, eventually the board of directors of these facilities are going to say this program has to go. And so that's where we're at right now. In the figures for corrals and sanctuaries are not on this page, but they are out there. We're roughly, I don't remember. I don't want to be too off base, but we're 30,000 horses in facilities, I believe, something like that. I think half of those are in lifetime sanctuaries. Sanctuary program is actually kind of interesting. It was created off of a model that was developed by a man named Alan Day. He was Sandra Day O'Connor's brother. He was a rancher in North Dakota that had a lot of connections with the federal government because of his sister. And he started offering to take wild horses out of these holding facilities and house them on ranch land that he had in Kansas and North Dakota and Nebraska. I think there's several different places. And that program, he was charging $0.25 a head a day, something like that. And he was managing these animals. He was making sure they weren't breeding, although they were all supposed to be sterilized. All the males were supposed to be sterilized before they arrived. But he managed them. He managed them like any rancher would manage livestock. And it was a pretty successful program. Unfortunately, for his sake at least, once his model was proven to be successful and proven to be profitable, he got outbid. And it was a grudge that he carried for the rest of his life. But the bidding process for the sanctuary program, or the holding program, had some flaws. And the federal government walked away from that program and then eventually returned back to a similar model where we're at now. And that's where they pay ranchers to house horses, just like you would pay somebody to background cattle or, winter breeding animals. It's the same program for wild horses. You get paid a certain amount in regular intervals to make sure that these horses don't die. And that's really it. It's every year you get audited to make sure that the animals that you were sent and you're being paid for are still on the property. And unfortunately, though, that it's expensive. It requires a huge amount of space. You have to be somewhere with no feral horse populations to have to worry about crossing over or anything. They see a lot of these operations set up in less than ideal locations, or there's a timeline on it that makes it unattractive. The old rancher that owns the place and runs the place is in his 60s, and so you've got 10 years before the kids take over and kick all these horses off of it, type of a thing. And so that program has some weaknesses, but it's an interesting idea. It's certainly better than the alternative, which is where most of the money that we talked about in the budget is going into, and that's feeding horses in short-term holding facilities or corrals in centralized locations around all of these herd management areas. And unfortunately, these holding facilities are often where you hear all of the bad publicity that gets spread around in regards to the wild horse conversation. Notably, last year, Carson City Holding Facility had 150 animals die, in part because of I want to say it was West Nile, but there was a disease outbreak, or maybe it might have just been equine influenza. But there was a disease outbreak, and before these animals could be vaccinated appropriately, and all wild horses, when they're collected off the range, they are vaccinated. But before they could get all the vaccinations done, or before the vaccinations had time to take effect, the entire population got sick, and 150 animals died of either the disease or symptoms of the disease. I think a lot of deaths were attributed to pneumonia. So we also had recently, like 50 burros died of basically stress in the last couple of weeks. And again, we only heard about that because it was in a corral. These animals would starve to death in the range. Nobody would be talking about it.
Right. So that leads me to my next question. cliff, because it's, at least for me personally, it's frustrating to hear these statistics, right? And it might be an elephant in the room for some people, but I feel like I definitely know where Ben stands, and I could probably guess where you stand on a lot of these things, especially since you don't represent the Horse Council anymore.
That's true. I do not work for the American Horse Council.
Yeah. So where is this sentiment coming from that you can't use fatal means to manage these herds? Because clearly
protected.
Okay, so it's, you feel like it's in the legislation. That's where this is coming from? Like it's in the actual legislation that protects these animals that you can't use fatal means to manage the herds?
The individuals and organizations that are advocating on behalf of the horses have influenced the interpretation of the Wild Horse and Burro Protection Act in that line of thinking. So it makes it very difficult for an elected official to publicly suggest euthanizing tens of thousands of horses annually, because that's, you have to remember, this isn't a one-shot deal. Unless we killed all of them, you're going to have to do this every single year. And it makes it very difficult for an elected official to make that suggestion based on how their constituents are interpreting the Wild Horse and Burro Protection Act.
That
so
makes
like
sense.
right
Because
now,
to me,
there have been
right now, is it legal in the United States to slaughter horses? Is that legal right now?
No.
Okay. Why not? Because to me, that seems like that sentiment is connected to that, you know, as a species, we're looking at horses differently. Because for me, like I was reading about this a little bit today, and you look at the Mustang problem, and I saw some of those numbers. Yours were much higher than the numbers I saw. But I looked at that, and then you see the herds of horses, and you think, well, if you approach this like a business, they're way off. That I don't know what they're doing, but you're not only losing, but you're out of control, and you're just reacting at this point. So it seems like part of that problem is that it's illegal to slaughter horses in the United States. And I mean, I don't want to go around killing horses any more than anyone else, but I don't want to go around killing horses any more than cattle. But cattle have a reason to get slaughtered because we eat cattle, and cows, we give them a good life and we slaughter them. So maybe if there was a market for horse products.
Well, so I'll jump in, and we can end this conversation right now. Wild horses that were taken out of herd management areas and are under the protection or control of the federal government are explicitly prohibited from being slaughtered for consumption outright. So then the only alternative legally for euthanizing animals en masse is doing just that, killing them and putting them in the ground, or killing them and leaving them live. That's it. There is no legal pathway to harvesting this population of horses for consumption or distribution. And that was explicitly put in the 70s because that was the major concern. Now, that is already a federal law. There will never be a correlation between wild horses being rounded up and wild horses being slaughtered. But the advocates for the wild horse population have a strong incentive to marry those 2 points in the general public's mind, because it's much more convincing that these horses are in need of protection from the federal government, because they're just going to start rounding them up and slaughtering them for dog food. And even though that can never happen legally, that correlation is a really, really strong talking point. And so whenever you talk about the wild horse this issue, you will always have somebody that says, well, the federal government is just trying to round these up so they can sell them to slaughterhouses in Mexico. And even though that legally can't happen, that is a strong narrative. Now, I say legally because there have been people who decided that they didn't care about breaking the law, and they just started adopting wild horses, as many wild horses as the federal government would give them, and then they immediately put them on trucks and sent them to Mexico. And a guy was caught, I want to say in Colorado, 4 or 5 years ago, and he had shipped dozens and dozens of horses, maybe into the hundreds of wild horses from his farm to Mexico, and just got away with it for years and years, until he basically told on himself.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's a felony. That guy should go to prison for every single one of those felonies that he perpetrated. Every single horse that he shipped is a felony. I think it was an old man, so I don't know that anybody actually bothered, but that people will find a way to break the law when there's money on the line. The reality of this situation, we talked about this last time a little bit, is there's not a lot of money in slaughtering horses these days. It's not really worth the gas to get them to Mexico or Canada. And even though these populations are perfect for that because they're untreated, unvaccinated, unmolested, free-range, organic, red meat source, these are the kinds of animals potentially that are partners, that the individuals and organizations in Canada would really like to be slaughtering, processing. This is an ideal population for that purpose, but because of the Wild Horse Protection Act,
and I didn't realize what you said earlier. I didn't know that the American beef industry basically campaigned to get horses out of the American diet because to me, and probably most people, it just wouldn't occur to me that horses were ever a part of our diet.
Absolutely. You have to remember, at least all of us of the fair complexion come from European countries that have many of them still have strong traditions of eating horse.
It makes
you guys
sense.
You guys have had a conversation about the impact of Genghis Khan and the ramifications of the Mongolian culture, the explosion as it went all the way east that it could, or west that it could. That culture of living off horses has left an indelible impact, and most of those Middle Eastern and Muslim countries around the Soviet bloc that still eat horse to this day. All of those Stan countries eat horse. And that's where the United States came from. Everybody here in the United States comes from somewhere else, effectively, and those cultures eat horse. What it took was the creation and the uniquely American skill and development of marketing. That's what it took to kill the consumption of horse in the United States. And someday, somebody will write, there's enough material there to write a really, really interesting book about how the cattle industry killed horse consumption.
Yeah.
The irony, though, is that the strongest advocate, the irony is that today, the strongest advocate for the resumption of horse slaughter in the United States is the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. They spend more money on fighting an absolute ban on horse slaughter than any other organization in Washington, D.C. And the reason that it's not culturally protected, we don't have a social license to continue slaughtering horses, is because of the efforts they undertook as an industry in the late 1800s.
Wow.
It's a very, very fascinating thing, but it's a whole other conversation.
Well, that makes complete sense.
But that's where the wild horse debate.
Well, I'm just real quick. I just want to say, like, if you look at the early part of COVID, when we were having supply chain backups, and they put down thousands of cattle in the Midwest, and I mean, most people don't even know about that, right? But they round up a couple of Mustangs, and some activist is already watching and waiting, and it gets on the news, and everyone freaks out. And just the cattle industry. I was going to ask you that question, but you already answered it. Is how we've got to think that way as a nation and as people nowadays. And I guess the cattle industry did a very good job making us think that way. That, I mean, for anyone listening, like, I've put down one horse in my life, and I'll be honest, I did cry a little bit. It was my horse. I loved it. But when I look at a problem like that on a big scale, I don't know, I immediately go to, like, just numbers and stuff. And so then I think of all those cows that got put down because they couldn't get slaughtered on time. And it was like, oh well, you know, they get a good death, a bullet to the head, and cheap, easy. We bury them and move on. And the cattle industry is trained as well.
Well, that having a horse as a red meat source was direct competition for the cattle industry, and there was a lot of fraudulent activities. The Upton Sinclair book, The Jungle, highlighted how just disgusting our food system was in the United States at the time. And so red meat was red meat. And if horse was cheaper than cattle, than beef, then that was going to be what ended up on people's table. The ramifications of that, downstream have been kind of the demonization of anybody that eats horse. We as horse enthusiasts, very, very few people are eager in our industry are eagerly looking for an opportunity to consume horse meat. And but that said, a lot of Americans, especially Americans within the horse industry, are looking for a way for horse processing to come back. We just want to send it to somebody else. We don't want to eat it ourselves. We just want it to be somebody else's dinner. And that system worked. There was an equilibrium. There was a balance between the cattle industry and the horse industry for a long time. That the cattle industry didn't care as long as it was going away. We have the wild horse conversation around all this, though, is irrelevant. What we would be talking about when we were talking about mass euthanasia like that, we have protocols in place to put down tens of thousands, or if not hundreds of thousands of horses at a time. After the foot and mouth outbreak in the UK, that elevated every single animal regulatory program around the world and incited them to develop and practice and perfect mass euthanasia protocols. And so what has been suggested officially is that if we were to just euthanize horses on the range, and again, it's not going to happen, but if it were to happen, what would likely occur is that individuals with firearms would euthanize whole bands of horses. So horses move in small herds or bands within a larger general area, right? And so there'll be multiple bands of horses within one herd management area. And all of those animals would be incorporated into the same final figures, but they're really in groups of 20 to 30 at a time. And that it is proven that these animals form emotional bonds. And so to limit the amount of suffering that any one horse or portion of horses in a group would have to go through, rather than just picking off the 10 oldest ones or the 5 males or any of that kind of stuff. Instead, you would liquidate an entire band at a time. And you would do that probably at a distance with trained professionals with high-powered rifles, because you can't get close enough to them to do anything else. And there's no point in investing the money and rounding these animals up because you still can't deadbolt them. To your point, where using a deadbolt or a captive bolt system is a tried and proven method of euthanizing horses in scale. You can't run horses through chutes. You can't run wild horses through chutes. They don't like it. And the cost and expense and potential safety concerns means that there's just no reason. So instead, you're finding, and where do you find a population of individuals that are skilled enough with a rifle to take those kinds of shots? They're not coming from within the industry. It's not necessarily going to be people who can rationalize, oh, it's just a number. And so there is a very legitimate concern. And again, this is proven that individuals who euthanize animals of any kind at that kind of scale tend to go through pretty traumatic post-traumatic stress syndrome. And that PTSD is a thing.
What are some examples of that, Cliff?
So, whenever we have mass euthanasia within the poultry industry to avian influenza outbreaks, we have noted within our USDA staff that creates a toll. But most significantly has been the research that's come out of the UK following the foot and mouth outbreak in the early 2000s. That event was such a unfortunate but valuable opportunity to track the ramifications of so many different things when it comes to large-scale livestock loss. We have financial data out of that, but we also were able to track the ramifications of what it looks like to euthanize and then dispose of, which is a part of the process that you can't ignore, tens of thousands of animals. And it had a significant impact on the animal health and animal regulatory community in the UK. I mean, because imagine, whole towns, and it would be a different situation, but imagine an entire community losing all of their livestock and having one person that was in charge of that program. Like, think about the emotional toll on you if you had to euthanize every single animal, with people screaming, "Please don't do that."
Yeah.
And that would be the exact same situation that any individual would have to go through here. To your point, nobody noticed when we had to euthanize thousands and thousands of hogs because they were too big to process during the pandemic. But every single one of these horses has a follower online. Most of these animals are on a website somewhere. Somebody has named them. People are documenting their lives. Yeah. Well, when you look at the donations that go into this, some of the organizations that are solely focusing on wild horse protection, they bring in a significant amount of fundraising every year, or they are successful in a incredible amount of fundraising every year. And financially, these organizations have the capacity and the ability to spend that very, very selectively and judiciously. And the skill that these organizations have in collecting money and then spending that to their benefit should not be ignored. They're professionals. They're using volunteers, but the people that run these things are professionals.
Without disclosing any names of businesses,
I want to
can you give like a brief,
go ahead, Ben.
like, can you give a brief example of like what one of these companies kind of does in terms of, like, even if they do just make money and spend it on something else, what do they advertise and how do they get the money from individuals to supposedly protect the Mustangs?
Yeah, so it's all pretty straightforward. The organizations are collecting money. They are documenting these animals and these populations. They are regularly sharing information on what's going on within the wild horse community or industry, air quotes industry. So they're providing information, and the people who have a strong emotional reaction to what's going on, they want to keep getting that information. And so, it's a lot of these organizations were established as blogs. Professional photographers have started some of the most significant organizations in this conversation, but you certainly have journalists, you have authors, you've got lots of people in the creative space who have been using these areas or these animals for their business already. Think about it. Everybody loves a picture of a herd of animals running across a beautiful background with their manes up and their tails up. And that's a beautiful image, right? That would go on any calendar that, there's millions of calendars. Well, those people are living in these communities. They're taking these pictures, and they're in the best place to share information about what's going on the ground. And, that's their job, is to take pictures, which means that if they're just taking pictures while also supervising the federal agents in charge of these animals, it's two birds, one stone, right? And so they started blogs, they started websites, they started Facebook groups, they started all these things to share the information that they were getting from real-time experience. And then the successful ones at least, were able to monetize that. They were able to create 501c3s. They were able to start fundraising on it. They were able to start employing themselves as staff for these 501c3s. And then all of a sudden, they are the voice of the wild horse debate. They are the professionals. They start sitting on boards and advisory councils. They start getting contacted by our elected officials. And, they are experts. Unfortunately, they're experts in their perspective. Very rarely do any of these individuals actually have a science background. They might claim something like that, but they're not nutritionists, behavioralists, ecologists. They're not livestock management specialists. They're not lawyers. There's not their expertise and their skill is just in what they've experienced and what they've witnessed. And generally their actual contribution is just how they're able to spin that conversation, dress it up for the general public's consumption.
Wow.
And that the benefit of having money for these people is it allows them to buy a bigger platform to start raising more money. And that's the most cynical way to look at it. And I'm not casting aspersions, but as a cynic, it is tough to see how these people interact with the general public and not see it as a shameless fundraising grab.
I had no idea.
That said, it does bring in the general public. Well, some of these groups, I don't think we're ever going to see a Super Bowl ad, but anything shy of that has been done in an effort to promote the wild horse protection perspective.
Right. But it's in their best interest to promote it because they've monetized it.
Yeah.
Right.
These people ought to be taxed.
Unfortunately, it's also not in their.
Because, they're almost like the most.
It's a nonprofit.
They're like equine professionals, basically. They're in the equine industry, just differently.
But they're a 501c3. And then you also cannot discount the more mainstream animal welfare groups. All of them have a wild horse position. All of them have a wild horse paid staffer. They all have people who are focusing on the wild horse issue. So Humane Society, ASPCA, PETA, all of them are also working on this issue. They are the groups that are taken the most seriously in this debate, but they are not the ones that are on the ground generally, and they are not the ones collecting the most information. They're not the ones pushing the narrative, so to speak.
So let me ask you this, Cliff. The people, and you kind of answered it with these the groups you just mentioned, but the people that are sharing this protect the horse sentiment, are they in line with kind of the same, are these people also like the anti-hunting, anti-fur trade, like that sort of deal? And I guess my real question would be, is there anyone out there who is protect all our horses, all our wild horses and don't euthanize them in any way, but I'm okay with so and so like killing an elk every year on the same piece of property.
Also, yes. So
that seems like an insane perspective to have, which I know like saying that doesn't progress the conversation, but it's 100% how I feel, because that just seems like the most ridiculous way to look at the world.
There are people out there. There's a really interesting gentleman that has an idea about collecting all of the wild horses off of these ecologically damaged areas or environmentally damaged areas and relocating all of those horses to the California coast or the hellfire. What's the mountain range out there?
The Sierra Nevada.
The Sierra Nevada range, and relocating all these horses there to prevent wildfires on our west coast. And so he feels very strongly that we should not be euthanizing horses. And he does not feel like we should. He wants to protect these horses, but he thinks that we just need to put them somewhere better. And in his mind, eating sapperlings in the Sierra Nevada mountain range is a better use of their abilities than starving to death or running into traffic in Nevada. I don't want to say his name, but he's out there.
But like, how much experience does he have with animals, though? Like, does he own a horse, or like because that's the thing. Everyone has an idea, but like, who's actually boots on the ground? He's a rancher.
Nope.
Okay.
Nope, he's done it. He's done it.
Yeah.
He has.
So he has something to back it up.
He was a computer programmer or something in the 90s, and he cashed out and retired and bought a ranch in, I want to say, Oregon. And when he bought this ranch, it was not great. I mean, I think he got it on the cheap. There was a lot of property. There was a lot of acreage. And so he adopted what eventually became a whole herd of horses. I want to say there's over 20 or 30. And they have free reign of his property, and they have been grazing his timber for years. And a lot of interesting things have happened in this little pocket population. He's not engaging with them, but they are desensitized to at least him. But a couple of interesting things that have come out of it. There was a long-held belief that mountain lions would not prey on adult horses. But interestingly, on his property, he was able to document that very thing. That the mountain lions, as they were coming back to his ranch, would start to hunt and consume adult horses. So that was interesting. Another interesting part was there was a pretty substantial wildfire in his area 5 years ago. He and his wife both were very involved in assisting the firefighters that were operating in that area. Unfortunately, his wife probably died, or his wife died. It was probably associated with the chemicals and smoke inhalation during her time working with the firefighters. But their property that was being grazed by these animals did not suffer the same kind of fire expansion or growth or incursion that his neighbors suffered that did not have horses trampling grass or trampling the underbrush or consuming the trees or whatever the horses are doing there. He also has proof of horses pretty much subsisting off of woody greens and bark and stuff like that. It's not very scientific. He would disagree with me. He's not much on podcasts. I'm sure I'm okay, but He has brought out college university researchers to document these things in a scientific and professional way. He has had some people at a university, I can't remember which one, but it was a land grant, it was a real one, that could statistically draw some correlations between what was happening on his property and what could happen at a larger scale. He has put together a very professional business plan for the benefit of the state of California should they choose to relocate 40 to 60,000 wild horses to the state from the Bureau of Land Management. He's done a lot of work. He's laid a lot of groundwork. He has some followers, some kind of devotees to that idea. But he's a rancher. He is an honest God rancher. Red meat, steak and potatoes kind of guy. No problem with hunting. In fact, the big cat research and documentation, he immediately took to the Dallas Safari Club, maybe, as an effort to try to fundraise off of that group, which is one of the largest lobbies in the country, and try to get them to fundraise and start privatizing the relocation of wild horses to areas that historically had big cats in an effort to increase the population of big cats in those areas so that hunting could come back. And then it would create a feedback loop of hunting tourism to these areas looking for predators that would then subsidize the relocation of wild horses, which, it's an idea.
Yeah.
I think there are some people that are that interested in predator hunting that might subsidize that kind of a thing.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, it is, ironically, it is not the first time.
I would be very curious to see his plan for herd management, though, because so that's a pretty cool idea. But now you take this herd of horses, you put them in the Sierra Nevadas, you still have that numbers problem. Anyone that's raised cattle, goat, sheep, horses, chickens, pigs, you name it, when you have male and female, we all know what happens. And so what's his plan for that down the road?
Well, so another reality that I think I've mentioned, but I might have glossed over a little bit. So a plan like this would require the Bureau of Land Management to round up all of these horses. The Bureau of Land Management has a protocol in place that every single time they round up a horse, all the males are castrated, everything gets vaccinated, and everything gets a Coggins test. And then everything is also branded, so that animal is identifiable on its neck for the rest of its life as a wild horse.
Well, they must leave some of the stallions ungelded, right? They must leave some of the stallions ungelded, because if you gelded everybody, then how does the herd reproduce at all? Are they AIing?
No. So everything they round up, anything they round up, never goes back on the range.
Oh, no, that makes sense. But I'm talking about
every single horse that gets rounded up
in the wild, like a managed herd in the wild. And let's say he did the Sierra Nevada thing, that herd in the wild. That makes sense. The stuff in captivity, but
but they would have had to be.
If he put them out there in that forest,
they would have had to be rounded up
on restocking them. Okay, so they're planning on because then it's only going to last for 15 years or however long those horses live, and then they're going to die out.
But every year they need correct. And every year the Bureau of Land Management would round up more horses from the protected herd management areas that needed a home. There. And sure, if you would still have all the other programs that could help find homes for Mustangs. The training program, there is the Mustang Roundup program and like-minded programs where select Mustangs are then given to trainers to then have a certain amount of time to train those animals, and then they come back for a competition and a show and then are sold. You have the jail programs or high school programs that I mentioned earlier, where individuals are given the opportunity to break horses, as a fundraiser type program or even just a therapeutic program. But then everything else that can't find a home would get put on a truck to California, and then fed to mountain lions. That's basically what the plan would be.
You're making me want to get this guy on the podcast, Cliff. That's what all of this story.
I don't think he's much on podcasts, but
surely he needs a platform for this.
Yeah, it is a plan. I have spent the last 7 years of my life making sure that I drop it here and there just to see if people get attached to it. But you can Google it is called the Wild Horse Fire Brigade.
Oh. I like it.
I mean, I'm not opposed if it works. I still am skeptical if that works.
It won't work.
But
it won't work.
Yeah.
It won't.
So what would be your
it would be a good opportunity to get horses out of. You can't control those animals, and you can't maintain those populations. You can't keep them where they need to stay. And so
they can't fence
those horses are not going to inherently want. Well, no, you can't fence. You can't fence in national and state parks.
Yeah, like an entire mountain range. It's like trying to fence in the Rockies.
An entire state.
I mean, if you take take half of that, you're taking $115 million, build a fence.
Well, and there's probably a lot of ranchers in the state of California that would love to see the federal government put up fence, but it's not feasible. It's not realistic. And those horses are going to migrate to places that are easier for them to live, right? That's what they do. And so
they'll go down to Bakersfield or wherever.
If you airdrop them into the place they need to be, within 6 weeks they will be on the highway, right? I mean, it's just what they do. And then the logistics of moving enough horses for it to have any kind of impact at all. I mean, moving 40, 60,000 animals that are unbroken, unwilling to move, and you're taking them to places that you don't have access to. It's just not feasible. It's an interesting idea. I like it a lot. I think it's a fun thing, but it's a pipe dream.
You could have an individual penalty
in 2000. well, there's some of that too. You have people that have suggested a harvest period like any other invasive species. Treat them like white-tailed deer. Issue state tags, issue a bounty.
Okay, that brings up. So I want to ask you this question later. But I want to do a thought experiment real quick. We've kind of been doing that for like the last 5 minutes anyway. So if I was given a magic wand and I am now king of everything, and like practicality and other people's opinions be damned, we're doing what I want to do. This is how I would think about the problem. And I realize this isn't going to happen, but it's our podcast, so whatever. I would think that, you mentioned all the different areas. There's roughly 250 herds of horses. You would manage those areas. Each one of those areas would get, okay, this is how many horses we're going to keep here. And it would be the exact same way that we manage every other species, even though they are feral, they're a non-native. So personally, I think you could make a strong argument that we should put forward eradication efforts to get rid of them, just like you would wild hogs or anything else. I think that is a totally feasible argument. I know it would never go. But say you want to keep the horses.
The sage-grouse people think that's a good idea. That's the option on the table from the sage-grouse people.
It makes complete sense because, I mean, I know different species get treated differently, but it doesn't seem right? Like feral hogs, oh my gosh, what a tragedy. They're tearing up the ground. You know what tears up the land more than anything else? Horses. Horses tear up land like no other animal possibly can. They're awful for it. So anyway, I realize that's not going to happen. But just like, with particular herds of elk or in the eastern United States, each county has tag limits for their deer. Basically, it says this is how many we need to maintain the population, and then it's going to be up to, federal or state biologists to determine, all right, because of that, we need to take this many off the range. And, we could even do it. We need to take this many mares. We need to take this many studs, right?
Uh-huh.
And then ideally, there'd be people who would want to do it. Because, again, I'm not saying we got to kill them, but somebody's got to take them. So, we find a way to get them off, whether it is people retraining them or they do go to Mexico and become blue buffalo or whatever dog food. I'm not against that at all.
Well, I got a guy in Russia that wants them, so there's always that too.
Well, yeah. and exactly, it's one of the, like, you made a great point about how what a resource they are as far as consumption is concerned. I get this is going way off base, but it's the same thing. Like all these people, they're hippies usually, and I'm not against hippies, but people who are like anti-fur trade.
Yep.
But then they'll go and wear some like Patagonia or whatever brand that has is made of 20 different types of like plastics and polymers and all this stuff. I'm like, I'm sorry, but this like proven renewable resource where you just trap whatever critter or trap however many beaver, and it works better than that synthetic material just made. Like, if you're worried about the health of the earth, that would make more sense to me than I'd rather eat horse than I would like fake meat or anything like that. So anyway, but I guess the moral of this soapbox rant that I'm on, because I do have really strong opinions about this. It's why I wanted to have you on to talk about it in the first place. The moral of all of it is I just don't I wish we could treat horses the way we treat every other wild species that we manage, because the North American model for managing wildlife is such a strong and proven method. And it seems to me, like we had the same problem with market hunting, like white-tailed deer almost went extinct. And when I was driving home to do this podcast with you, I almost hit like 10 of them,
Mm-hmm.
And so they got rid of market hunting. I understand that, but they didn't completely destroy a way to manage the population, which is effectively what has happened with horses. And it drives me nuts, and I understand why. It's because we don't treat horses like we treat everything else, because they have special meaning to us. So anyway, if I was king of the world and I had my magic wand, we wouldn't see horses any different than we'd see elk, deer, bison, whatever. And we would have a enormous reverence for them, but we would still manage them the same way we manage all the other wildlife under the North American system.
The only difference, I mean, yes, well said. It's a good idea. You would need that magic wand to make that happen.
Exactly, and I understand that. But again, it's my podcast, and I needed to rant. So
the biggest problem we have with managing horses, like we do other game species, is that Americans don't hunt horses. There are people who shoot horses. That's not to say that there aren't people who want to shoot horses. We had 30 or 40 feral horses in a non-controlled herd that were shot at and injured or killed a couple of weeks ago in New Mexico, I think. We hear about domestic horses being shot all the time.
Wasn't there a big to-do, like the Pueblo or one of the tribes out in the Southwest? They tried to do a horse hunt a couple of years ago, right? And that was like a big stink up. Yeah.
And it was an individual, I would say an advocate or an activist, was trying to prove a point. And he is the individual that was putting it on, or that was initiating the conversation. Is a resident of a reservation, but he's not actually a member of the tribe, if I understand that relationship correctly. And he has spent a long time trying to open an abattoir or slaughterhouse on a reservation and try to skirt the federal prohibition, air quote prohibition, on horse slaughter. That's not going anywhere. Nobody wants those facilities in their backyard. Nobody's going to feed into that, and there's no money in it. If you can't sell the product, you're never going to be able to keep the lights on. And so, as part of his kind of next stunt, he convinced a group of people on a reservation to host a horse hunt, and he issued tags. They had a lottery, 4 tags. Unfortunately for him, he never got the proper authorities from the tribal elders on the reservation. And so while it was going on online, there was no authority for it to ever happen. And it may or may not have just been some kind of grift to get people's cash that were buying, air quotes, buying tags for this event. I was in contact with tribal leadership when that event was supposed to be held, and they informed me that nobody in a leadership position had ever greenlit any of it, and it was never going to happen. It was never going to happen as far as the tribe was concerned. But it did get a lot of attention on Facebook. It got a lot of attention on Twitter, and those horses were all feral. You know, I mean, we started the conversation with a definition between wild and feral, and all we've talked about is wild horses because the nature of that conversation is so juicy. But if we want to get into the feral population, there's a lot of ins and outs. There's a lot of anecdotes around the feral horse population in the United States and how those animals are treated. When I was still in D.C., we got a phone call from the U.S. Army, and they had 975 feral horses at Fort Polk in Louisiana. What had happened is at some point, they suspect around World War II, while horses were still a part of the military industrial complex, but not overtly necessary, the base maintained a population of horses. And then as the base phased that part of their infrastructure out, rather than selling those horses or dispersing those horses, they were just kind of released on the back 40. And rumor has it that those horses all created a little population within the fences, within the boundaries of the base, and they could never leave. And so they just began to propagate. In reality, based on evidence that was supplied by the base's commander, individuals from the local community probably were turning horses loose on the base, on places where the public could sneak in through the fence, so to speak. And so this population was probably being supplemented by the local community, and it grew and grew and grew and grew and grew. And over the decades, they had almost 1,000 horses on an active military base. And these animals became a local attraction and kind of a tourist attraction where people would drive to the base and look at the horses through the fence, and then all the people on base had to navigate around these animals during training procedures and firing drills and all kinds of other things. They impeded traffic on the base. They caused property destruction. They were a menace. But because they were technically on federal property, they did not have a protocol for removing them, because they weren't every other wildlife species. There's a protocol for it. They know how to deal with white-tailed deer populations. They know how to deal with endangered bat populations. They know how to deal with bug populations. But nobody had ever written out a protocol for how to deal with horses. And because of the wild horse debate and the local community's interest in this population of horses, they just ignored it. They just pretended like it was not something they could do anything with, and they just moved on. And then during the Trump administration, I believe, they finally decided that they had to do something. And so they issued a 75-day notice nationwide for anyone that wanted to come and claim those animals. And if they weren't claimed, they were going to euthanize them. And oh my God. Now, these animals don't have any federal protections, right? They're not owned by anybody. They're trespass animals on federal land. They are not protected. But we had people that were trying to get them classified as their own breed and then classify that breed as an endangered species. We had people that were calling and trying to rework the Wild Horse Protection Act to accommodate all federal bases. We had people who were trying to get this individual, the base commander, fired so that he could not follow through on his horse murdering spree. Everything you can think of came out about all this. And again, people were really leaning into narratives about how this, these horses were veterans or the progeny of veterans. These animals are the direct descendants of World War I war horses, and they deserve to be honored and revered. And then when these animals started being collected, we found out that they were every type of horse that never would have been present in any kind of military system. So clearly people were just dropping off unwanted strays. But that didn't change the narrative at all. The Fort Polk horses, that the U.S. government had to stop and do a full study on them. And there was like a several 100-page report about these animals. It was an absolute disaster trying to get these horses out of the military's way. And that's a side of the federal horse thing where there's no protections, there's no obligations. Nobody's expected to do anything out of the ordinary to take care of these horses. And if they don't function or they don't provide a service for the community around them, they're just a hazard. Stray dogs, stray cats, they're just a hazard. Pythons in the Everglades, these are potentially dangerous animals when not domesticated and trained appropriately or given enough space so that they do not interact with human beings.
Yeah.
It's just a reality.
This Mustang issue, as long as it persists, and maybe that'll just be for the rest of our lives and longer, but it seems like a magnet for more causes like that where people want to add to the problem and use it as kind of a cover or a backing for their own cause. But Cliff, in light of what Joe said there a couple minutes
ago,
about his sort of mind experiment, I guess you could say, or his rant, what would be your own rant? And subsequently, what is actually legal and feasible to start putting in place so that taking care of the problem, not adding to it?
So
this story you just told about the military base.
If I had $1 billion to spend just on this problem, which would mean that billions of dollars are spent on billions of other problems, because there's a lot of things that are a bigger deal than this. But if I had $1 billion to spend on this problem, my first thing would be I would hire an individual to be responsible for every single herd management area in the United States. And that is not the case today. There is not a singular human being responsible for each location and each population. The federal government is very good at giving people jobs. And this is a job where having a specific person responsible could actually provide some value. And the next thing that I would do is I would make every single one of those people that are now responsible for that specific herd, they would have to be responsible for marketing that herd. They would take, the federal government would take responsibility and ownership of those animals, and then they would be the ones responsible for making them the social media darlings that all horses deserve to be. And then every single year, every single one of those herd management areas gets every single horse rounded up, and they get vaccinated. We wean stud colts. We castrate males. We maintain and manage every single one of those herds individually every year. And it's not really feasible in today's system. It is so expensive to do this. But the reality is that these horses are not providing value to anything or anyone by being just rogue, purely wild horses. They're not. But we have very actionable data about how much value wild horse populations can provide if they're desensitized to people and you build an infrastructure that allows the general public to experience those animals.
Yeah.
You know, the cheap ponies make money. Not a lot. It's not changing anybody's lives, but that is a business, that is an industry in itself. It provides value, it provides education, it provides opportunity for a lot of people in that community, and everybody else that is passionate about horses then has an opportunity to take advantage of that group. And we don't need them eating out of your hand. We certainly don't want them running up on the highway. But if you create infrastructure to maintain these animals, we can get the environment to a place where the land itself will be able to sustain them. And then you can start taking care of the land and we can start doing things like protecting sage grouse, like reintroducing amphibians, reptiles, and fish to some of these waterways that don't really exist anymore. We can start looking into what predator opportunities are available, and we can start actively introducing predators to naturally maintain populations in areas that historically had predators but no longer do. You know, I mean, the wolf situation in the national parks is a problem, but one big cat could do a lot of work to maintaining or decreasing foal crops every year. And if they're eating foals, they're not going after calves. You know, if they're eating foals, they're not going after sheep. They're not going after dogs. You know, if we get healthy populations, and there is evidence that big cats will eat horses. But it takes money, it takes time. You got to reintroduce shit. You're capturing, collaring, and reintroducing big cats into the American West. None of that is cheap. None of that is easy. Yeah. But there's a lot of goodwill that comes out of these collaborative cross-sector programs. And that's what has to happen, is you have to make the horses a resource. And right now, they're not a resource. They're a line item. And that line item is getting bigger. And like I said, it was $11 million. When I was at the Horse Council, when I started at the Horse Council, the budget for that program was $80 million. So in 5 years, it's gone up $60,000, $60 million. $60 million is an outrageous amount of money. Do you know how much money the USDA spent on horses every year? How much money the USDA spends on horses every year? $500,000. Wow. The USDA spends $500,000 a year on horses. No, $500,000. That is staff. That is all. The only money the USDA spends on equine programs is staff. Animal care has their own budget. We talked about the horse soaring situation last time I was on the podcast. But outside of animal care, within the veterinary service program, they spend $500,000 a year. Now, can you imagine how the horse industry could benefit from having $50 million, much less $150 million?
Yeah.
The kind of support, research, and development that we could go through. But instead, we're using that to feed horses that nobody wants. And that's another part of this conversation, going back to the feral conversation, is that anything that you do with the wild horse population is inevitably going to conflict with the narratives around the feral horse population. That what the government is suggesting is that if we have 80,000 wild horses and we're only supposed to have 25,000 wild horses, then that means that there's 55,000 horses that need to be adopted this year. and if it doesn't happen, if those 55,000 horses are not adopted this year, then you're going to have exponentially more horses next year that need to be adopted. Now, I don't remember if I touched on the importance of horse adoption, but the horse adoption system in the United States is getting better and better and better. It's getting more professional every year. The American Horse Counsel has a big part in that. There are a lot of other organizations that are involved. But the American Horse Counsel has a program called the Equine Welfare Data Collective that documents how many and takes a statistical analysis of the horse rescue system in the United States. And that program has figured that at any given point, there is between 5,000 and 10,000 empty stalls in a professional adoption or rescue program in the United States. That's not 55,000. And none of those empty stalls are prepared for an undomesticated horse. So the feral population, you're looking at a mix mash. You don't know. Maybe some of them are domesticated, maybe not. But that undocumented, unaffiliated population of feral horses can't easily slide into the rescue system. But they can slide in that rescue system much more easily than the wild horse population can. And so now you have two conflicting interests. You have this group of animals that need a new home. They're in a bad situation. They might be, quote unquote, homeless, like the feral population is. But now they're directly competing with a subsidized adoption program coming out of the federal government. And so, who do you support? Who's the good guy in that? Somebody is going to lose. And what has happened in the past has been that the federal government have been ignored and their adoption numbers have been poor because the feral horse population and the unwanted horse population, or horses in transition, have taken precedent, been the priority.
That makes sense.
And some people take that very seriously. They feel very strongly that the federal government should not be subsidizing their direct competition.
Sure. I can see that.
Which is also why the stock type breed organizations, specifically AQHA, and I apologize to any AQHA fanboys out there, but the AQHA feels very strongly about any program that puts more trained Mustangs on the market, because the AQHA has officially stated they feel that Mustangs are direct competition for their own horses.
Wow.
I guess I could see that to a point.
I disagree, because I don't know anybody showing fancy quarter horses, spending real money on quarter horses, that would rather have a shaggy ass Mustang. Yeah. But they feel like it is a clear and present threat to their breed and their organization.
Yeah, I guess it just depends on what kind of AQHA member you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, all I can personally speak to, and Joe, like I'm sure you could attest somewhat, but as two guys that ride horses for the public, like when's the last time you recommended one of your clients go buy a Mustang? I mean, adopt a Mustang. I'm going to say like zero. And every Mustang I've ever had come to me, Joe probably has the same thing. We get quite a few people, by the time they send a horse to us, it's not always like the top-notch horse in terms of, it's a little more rank every now and then. And then you got to even turn some down because they figure They figure if it's an easy
A
horse
little
to train,
more
they
rank
do it
is a nice way to
themselves a
say
lot of
that.
times, right? And so you do get these horses that come through sometimes, and Mustangs are right up there. And I know I've been around a few that were nice old plugs or like old ranch horses, but a lot of these Mustangs, and I turn a lot of them down, honestly, but I'll get one every now and then. And they're projects. And I would never recommend someone go adopt a Mustang. I wouldn't recommend myself go adopt a Mustang just because you only have one life. And there's some very nice horses out there. And I mean, regardless of what you think, I like a lot of quarter horses. Yeah, granted, there's some American quarter horses that aren't that great either, right? They're set up kind of weird, but there's some great horses out there, and I don't want to waste my life just working with Mustangs. And I wouldn't recommend it to anyone else.
Yeah, I completely agree, Ben. Someone asked me once about Mustangs, and I said, what we need to do is we need to just take all the Mustangs and kind of pick which ones we let reproduce, and we just need to do that for like a solid 250 years, and then we'll have some.
I told you that's how this population got started. They were cultivated, they were maintained, they were managed by the people who lived around them and could harvest from them. And you have to remember the type of people that we're talking about back then. Your first generation, or very closely related to family member who got off a boat from Central Europe. So you're talking 5'5" was a big boy. They're hungry. You know, it's freezing, it's miserable. They're digging a house out of the mud, so they're skinny. And so a population of animals that you could get on from the ground, you know, having a bunch of 14-hand, 15-hand stock type horses that could move but could also drag a cart. That was an attractive animal at that time. You know, yeah. Big feet, hairy. They could live outside their entire lives. They had a color pattern that made them discernible from the buffalo or the cattle that they were chasing after. These animals were bred specifically for a purpose. And it is not the purpose that any of us on this call today need those horses to meet anymore. And when they stopped being managed in the 50s, by the 50s, then you started getting all of the structural problems and all of the kind of idiosyncrasies that come from all they have to do is reproduce. They don't have to do anything else. So I will note they have good teeth generally, and they have very strong reproductive systems. But their legs are crap, their feet are crap, they have terrible attitudes, their vision is not always the best. They have all these weird problems that tend to come out as they turn 15 or 16 years old. And it's all because those are not the traits that are important out there, you know? And oh my God, and their legs and their feet, oh my God, they got hard feet. I will give them, the one thing they do have is they have hard feet. They're usually turning in every direction except for straight ahead, but they do have hard feet. And, you know, and it's just not an animal that we are going to be able to successfully market for anything other than lawn ornaments. And they make good lawn ornaments. They make good stories. You know, the East Coast is disproportionately adopting more of these animals than any other part of the country. And what we're seeing, what the Bureau of Land Management is reporting, is that the most success they find is in the Southeast. And it's because horse owners are in a position to adopt these animals and put them in the front paddock next to the road and leave them be. And usually by the time they've ridden in a trailer for 3-4 months trying to get adopted, and what the Bureau of Land Management does is they actually trailer these horses from their holding facilities out west to horse communities in the East Coast, known horse communities in the East Coast, and then they run these adoption drives where they basically just run every single horse through a sale ring, and then everybody they invite everybody. It's a big party. It's a big event. Local community comes out, and they just adopt as many of these things out as they can. And people take them, and they put them in a front yard, and they've got a whole equine operation in the back. But they have that paddock out front, that they don't really want to put any clients' horses in because God forbid something gets in there, or or they don't want to put any fancy out there in case it disappears in the middle of the night. So they'll put this basically, rabid animal in the front yard, and it'll keep the neighbor's kids from crossing the fence, and it'll look pretty, and it gives everybody a cool story about that freeze-branded Mustang out in the front yard. And maybe they work on it. Maybe they put the neighbor kid on it for a little while, but nobody's expecting anything from it. It's just a story. It's a pet. And we don't have 55,000 households in the United States looking for that kind of pet.
Yeah.
We just don't.
And we shouldn't be encouraging 55,000 households in America to adopt that kind of a pet either.
Amen.
The American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals did a survey on their own. And in this survey that they did on their own, they determined that there were 1 million households in the United States that wanted to adopt a horse.
Wanted,
and so,
being the key word. Not should, wanted.
In their mind, the slaughter issue is a non-issue, the wild horse issue is a non-issue, the feral horse issue is a non-issue, because there's just all these people who are dying for the opportunity to bring home a horse that they can't touch and is probably carrying a communicable disease. And that's a narrative that is running around Capitol Hill right now. It doesn't matter that I was there telling our elected officials anything different. Once that kind of information goes out there, it's really hard to reel that narrative back in. And then it makes it very difficult to have people make the hard decisions that are necessary. We had an individual who came to the Bureau of Land Management with a business proposal and said they were willing to take 40,000 wild horses off their hands. And they were going to put all of them on a boat, and they were going to send all of them to Russia, and they were going to turn them loose in Kamchatka, which is the Russian version of Alaska. And they were going to turn them all loose so they could be eaten by Siberian tigers. And then once those 40,000 horses were gone, they'd come back and get the next 40,000 from us. And, it's ridiculous, but maybe there's some value to it. But you're never going to get an elected official to make that kind of a decision when he hears that there are a million backyards looking for a horse.
Yeah. But nobody wants to get their hands dirty, right? And we have the same problem with, we eradicated slavery in the United States, and now we farm it out to, folks in Ethiopia and places over there in Africa where they're mining cobalt out of the ground, and we don't have to worry about it anymore.
Nike in Bangladesh.
We just do that with just about all of our problems.
Right.
But I would have to say, Cliff, I think my only question at this point this evening is, how do we get you in that management position, and would you take it if you could have that perfect?
That's exactly what I was thinking.
No, it doesn't exist. I mean, that's the problem. It just doesn't exist. The Trump administration, the Obama administration, the Trump administration, and the Biden administration have all had individuals at the highest levels that have been committed to resolving this issue in a deliberate way. In a deliberate way. And they were all a little different, but they were all about creating programs and infrastructure that would allow for protocols to go into place to create a consistent resolution to these problems. Whether, regular roundups, proven adoption methods, wide-scale sanctuary programs, and comprehensive euthanasia protocols when appropriate. And every single one of those administrations failed to get anything even remotely close off the ground. And instead, all they did was just greenlight an extra $10 million on the budget.
Oh, yeah.
And so there's not
way easier.
Because it ends the conversation. It gets these people off your back for at least 12 months. And that's, unfortunately, there is not a seat in the country that has the authority to solve this problem. And so, in reality, I'm a strong proponent for industry initiatives. I think the industry is, if this wild horse issue is ever going to be addressed, and specific to the feral stuff, that's easier to go after. I think the industry is going to have to come together and commit to creating a system to put these horses somewhere. And that goes back to a nationalized adoption program. That goes to centralized leadership and the right amount of funding to maintain a consistent leadership within this system. And there just hasn't been. Every organization that means well steps up, takes the reins, leads the charge for 5 or 6 years, and then their methodology or their functionality goes away, becomes irrelevant, gets outdated, and then the next new organization that's shinier and bigger, they take over the reins as the head of this kind of effort. But it's never centralized, it's never structured, and it can't maintain. And that's really what we need to solve this problem. Is we need adoption options. Euthanasia is just never going to be on the table, and it could be. It should be. Honestly, it should be. We didn't talk about. There's a laundry list of characters in this debate that are coming at this from an ecological perspective. We have the groups of people who insist that these animals are native and are important to the environment in these areas, ignoring all of the evidence that we can see. We didn't talk about the rancher perspective in this, or the rancher's culpability in a lot of this. The ranching industry has a lot to do with this debate, and they've got some bad actors in their space that are making things worse. We didn't get a chance to talk about the environmentalists that are involved in this and the strange bedfellows that come together. The sage grouse community is very tightly tied to the ranching community, in that the sage grouse community, which hates ranchers, because they are convinced, probably accurately, that the sheep and cattle industries are the reason why sage grouse aren't coming back. But they are united in blaming wild horses for the environmental degradation that makes it impossible for sage grouse to return to some of these areas. And so you see these guys that scream and holler and yell at each other all across the country every day, that the only thing they can agree on is that the wild horse and burro problem is worse. There's a lot. It's a widespread issue. There's a lot of players. There's a lot of movers and shakers. There's a lot of money, and unfortunately, the only people that are the horses are not getting a better end of this deal. As the days go on and the issue gets worse, the part of this conversation that's taking it on the chin the hardest is the horse population.
I'm sure we'll have to have.
There you go. I don't know if it was. I don't know if it was a uplifting conversation, but it was a very informative conversation.
Yeah.
Not uplifting.
Yeah.
You will never have me come on to be uplifting, buddy. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So there you have it. Cliff Williamson, our resident equine policy consultant. You're a reoccurring guest now. You're among, at the moment, you're one of 2 people who has made multiple appearances on the podcast. So
there we go. That's what I want to see. We'll figure out the third one. I need to beat everybody else. So we'll figure out the third one soon.
Oh yeah, just figure out what other hot button issues we can tackle.
Immigration. You guys want to talk about immigration?
Oh yeah. Yeah, actually, yeah, and I don't even want to get into that right now, but just immigration,
workers' rights,
control, and their use of horses and all that, and why they shut that down. But that's a whole topic, I'm sure. But Chris, we'll definitely have you back. Cliff, we'll definitely have you back on, because I know we won't, but if we solve the Mustang problem, there's another problem after that, and another one after that, and these problems just
I'd love to.
on. So always something to keep us occupied with.
Awesome.
All righty.
Thanks for the opportunity.